Today's webinar, where we'll be looking at the impact dealing with invoice exceptions has on your team and your organization. And as I'm sure you know, those exceptions and the time spent managing them are a major source of waste and actually an opportunity cost for businesses. So we'll be looking at the effect manual intervention can have on your payment performance, your resources and your supplier relationships as well. But it's not just about dealing with those exceptions as they occur. It's also a question of understanding the root causes of them. So today we'll be discussing with OB10 the difference straight-through processing can make to your operations, taking you through the results of a recent survey highlighting the different ways you can actually eliminate exceptions and taking a look at the role automation plays in the journey. So if you're heading up or responsible for large areas of the P2P process in your organization, no doubt you're under pressure to achieve more, often with access to fewer resources. But the trouble is, without best processes in place, best practice processes in place, and especially if you're spending valuable time dealing with invoice exceptions, it's very hard to hit those expectations. So this webinar, with the help of Danny Thompson from OB10, will show you how it's possible to take a close look at your existing processes and evaluate what you need to change to really generate value and hand the power back to your team. So before I hand you over to Danny, let me just tell you a bit about your presenters today. Danny Thompson is VP for Strategic Customer Relations at OB10. And before he joined OB10, he spent 4 years in Pfizer Inc.'s Global Financial Shared Services, most recently as Global Process Driver for Invoice to Pay. And before that, he spent 9 years with International Paper Company's Business Process Design Finance Program. So he really has lots of knowledge in this area. As I'm sure most of you already know, I'm Ellen Leith, editor of Accounts Payable News. Right, so just before we begin, here's a quick look through at the agenda for today. So as I've already mentioned, Danny is going to take you through the results of the survey, examining the full scope of the problem in today's organizations, taking a close look at straight-through processing, what that actually means and how it can be achieved, taking into account cultural and technological enablers. So the session is interactive, and you do have the opportunity to ask questions by adding them into the free text box there over on the right-hand side. So if you type these in, I can ask Danny to address them at the end of the webinar. And we are also going to have a couple of polling questions today, and I'd be grateful if you could all take part in answering these by clicking on the appropriate response as it appears on your screen, and then we're going to share those results with you. Okay, so as you go through the webinar, if you can think of those questions and we can come as they occur to you, and we can address those through to you at the end. Okay, so let me now pass you across to Danny Thompson of OB10. So over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Ellen. Just as a brief introduction, OB10 is a global e-invoicing network. With 48% of the Fortune 500 trading on the network, and we're operational across North America, EMEA, and Asia Pac, and partner with 6 of the top 9 F&A BPOs that support about $158 billion in commerce annually. Earlier in the year, we conducted a survey of top P2P professionals focusing on invoice exceptions, and I think you'll find the results interesting. We had over 200 responses with professionals in a variety of roles in the P2P space, and across a wide variety of jurisdictions and industries around the world. Our idea was that the survey results would improve our understanding of the causes of invoice exceptions and then really show a strong business case for using automation to eliminate invoice exceptions and achieve straight-through processing. The results were pretty interesting, and I think you'll find them to be interesting. First, let's talk about what an invoice exception is, and that discussion starts with the thought of what is a perfect invoice? What's nirvana for accounts payable? And I think of a perfect invoice as an invoice where the supplier knows exactly what the invoice should look like. They generate it. It's received by accounts payable in a perfect state and can be processed without any hiccups along the way, processed and paid along the way. So what's an invoice exception? An invoice exception is any factor along the way that prevents the invoice from being processed and approved as soon as it arrives. More specifically, our survey pointed to some specific causes of invoice exceptions. The first one isn't covered on this chart, but it's fairly basic. We asked survey participants what percentage of their invoices come with purchase orders and which ones are processed without purchase orders. Around 35% of all invoices across our survey participants are processed without a purchase order. And of course, any invoice that comes in without a purchase order is having to be touched by someone inside the company, the buying company. So requiring purchase orders on all inbound invoices can have a significant impact. For the remaining 65%, the PO-related invoices, we asked what were the top causes of exceptions, and this is what we found. PO, price, quantity discrepancies, over 80% of participants identified this as a top cause. No valid PO on the invoice, even though a PO is required, was second. The goods not received before the invoice arrived was a third, also over 50%. Miscellaneous charges, so we're talking here about freight and demurrage and other special charges on invoices that were unexpected. Service purchase orders are a challenge because someone needs to confirm that the service was actually performed and that the amount being charged is accurate. Blanket orders create challenges as well, and then others. So how often do these exceptions occur? Our next survey question, we asked participants what percentage of their invoices have exceptions, and we wanted to examine whether organization size had an impact on the answer. And while there was some variation across the different company sizes, the survey results all averaged out around 30%. So you can see for companies that process less than 50,000 invoices a year, about 30% of their invoices encountered an exception. For 50,000 to 250,000, it's a little bit higher. The mid-sized companies, 250,000 to 500,000 invoices, were even higher. And even the very large companies with efficient shared services organizations still had 27% and 29% of their invoices hitting an exception along the way. So in short, about 3 out of every 10 invoices is encountering an exception. 85% of our survey responses reported that eliminating PO exceptions would be one of the most effective ways of reducing costs. They see these exceptions as driving their costs up in AP. In what ways is this driving cost? Well, the first question, first indicator is the percentage of phone calls received due to PO invoice exceptions. You can see the number is in the 30 to 45% range depending on organization size. So about a third of the calls going to small organizations are related to PO invoice exceptions. And for the largest of companies, well over 40% of their invoices result in phone calls. So what does this mean in terms of manpower, not only from a phone call perspective, but across the entire organization? We calculated the number of hours required to process all of these invoice exceptions based on transaction volume and the 30% figures that we received out of the survey results, and found that if you take the average number of man hours is somewhere in the 4-hour range per exception, then the number of man hours expended on resolving exceptions is quite significant. In the smallest organizations where they're processing less than 50,000 invoices, they spend about 14,000 man hours addressing invoice exceptions. And in the largest companies with more than 1 million transactions, they spend 700,000 man hours addressing invoice exceptions. So how does that figure translate into FTEs? The figures are are quite dramatic. For the companies with more than 1 million transactions, then they have approximately 39 FTEs focused on addressing invoice exceptions in a given year.
Okay, thanks, Danny. So this is our first polling question for you today, which I'd be grateful if you could answer as it comes up to you on the screen in just a moment. So the question is, in your company, what is the average number of work hours required to resolve an invoice exception? And really, we want you to include all groups within that. So you're going to be looking at AP, procurement, and AR. So you want to be, you've got the options there in front of you. So 1 hour or less, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, or 5 hours or more. So if you could make those selections, please, and we can share those results with you. At the moment, I can see that just 45% of you have answered. So if the rest of you could make your responses, we can close the poll and give you those results. So I'm going to be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to share those results with you. Okay, so there's some interesting results there. I can see that the majority of the people on the call today are responding with 2 hours. So you've got 36% of you looking at that average number of work hours as 2 hours, and 32% 1 hour or less. Got the remainder sort of in the sort of 22% in the 3 and 4 hours, and 7% there is 5 hours or more. Just going to close that now for you. All right, so some interesting results there, Danny.
Thanks. You're right. They are interesting, and of course, those the number of hours varies from company to company. Just I encourage you to think about those hours compared to the percentage of exceptions that occur, the number of exceptions that occur in your organization. So beyond the additional work, there's some other interesting results in the survey. Our survey participants, 75% of them reported that PO invoice exceptions are one of the biggest sources of friction between finance and procurement. So, finance gets frustrated with procurement about the occurrence of these exceptions, and vice versa. Procurement gets frustrated with finance. Why is that? Why are they frustrated? Well, for a variety of reasons. These invoice exceptions, according to our survey participants, result in late payments, in increased operating costs, unhappy suppliers who get frustrated with the billing process, unhappy internal customers because they feel like they're wasting time or that their supply chain is being disrupted, lost discounts, and as I mentioned before, supply chain disruption. So a variety of impacts that result in friction. Looking specifically at late payments, the average percentage of late payments due to PO invoice exceptions is quite high as well. The survey participants reported anywhere from 24 to 45% of their payments of their late payments are due to PO invoice exceptions. So if you could reduce PO invoice exceptions, then of course the number of late payments would be reduced as well. Despite all of these impacts, so the negative impacts of invoice exceptions, we were surprised to find that only 43% of the companies that participated in our survey have formal tracking metrics in place to measure invoice exceptions. The impact is significant, but no one seems to be paying attention, or most people don't seem to be paying attention. We think the results that we've looked at so far, the survey as a whole, kind of serve as a call to action. We really need to take a new view on invoice exceptions by redefining what is normal in AP. Certainly not paying attention to a problem that is this big is not what we should be doing going forward, particularly as new tools and technologies become available to us. So now let's just talk about redefining normal a bit. As instead of accepting so many exceptions and their resulting impacts, we need to adopt straight-through processing as the new normal. We can do that by taking an end-to-end view of AP quality. So if you think about accounts payable as a manufacturing process, most of the manufacturing processes in our organizations would never accept a 30% error rate. They're looking for very low error rates because errors equate to waste. In AP, the challenge has always been hard because AP hasn't been able to control the quality of inputs. In a manufacturing process, you can choose your suppliers, you can define very tight specifications and control all of the inputs. But AP typically has been at the tail end of the process and has had low power to control the inputs to the process. But we think that new technologies that have been come on the market in the past few years and have matured provide greater control over the inputs. And then there are many cultural and process changes that we see occurring in companies around the world that are making a big difference. Let's think about straight-through processing and making straight-through normal. First thing I want to discuss is what is straight-through processing. In my experience in talking with companies around the world, it has straight-through processing has very different definitions for different companies. Option one is this idea of straight through to AP. If we can get the invoice to come straight through to AP and to automatically trigger the AP data entry workflow, then some companies consider that straight through processing. And that's an important goal. Other companies think a little bit farther through the process. They think of straight through as straight through to the approval process. So AP doesn't even touch the transaction. The invoice comes in, gets posted to the accounts payable system, and if there's an exception, then the exception is automatically routed through some sort of resolution process. So they don't enter the invoice in AP, it gets created in AP and routed automatically to the appropriate approvers or people responsible for resolving the problem. And then lastly, I think option 3 is straight through to payment. And this is really straight through processing nirvana and what we really want to achieve in a process that is similar to a manufacturing process with no exceptions. So not only is the invoice not touched by AP, it's not touched by procurement or finance, and it's approved without any sort of human interaction. And if we can get a process like that where an invoice goes all the way through to payment without anyone having to interact with it, yet we have confidence that it's a valid invoice and meets all of our approval requirements, then we've really hit the ideal state for accounts payable. So with a few exceptions, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, this third option, straight through to payment, is what this presentation is all about, trying to reach that point. So now, Ellen, polling question 2.
Yeah, so that really leads us on to the second polling question that we have for you today. So what does straight through processing mean to you? So if we can just answer, as the question comes up on the screen now, have a think about what you would call straight through processing. We've got some options there. Option 1, which is straight through to AP. Option 2, straight through to exception. And then lastly, option 3, which is straight through to payment. Take a little time to think about what that straight through process really means to you in your organizations. And I can see now that just about half of you have voted. If you could take some time to think about that a little more. And I should be closing the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So just close that poll and share those results with you. Okay. All right. So we can see that that there is a certain amount of discrepancy between those 3 options, what people think is straight through processing. Just over half rooting for option 3, 54% there with straight through to payment, but a sizable quantity there, 36% saying straight through to AP. Okay, so we're just going to close that now. Okay, so does that sort of follow on from what you were imagining there, Danny?
Yeah, that's falls right in line with what we typically see. There's a variety, and really depending on the maturity of the process and the point along the journey of automating transactions, that where a company is along that journey really helps define which of the definitions there is applicable to them. What we want to take a moment to talk about now is, well, how do we move through the different stages of straight-through processing? And really the first thing that we need to do to get invoices into AP, straight into AP, is eliminate snail mail. That is, get rid of the paper invoice that's being printed, stuffed, mailed, received, scanned, and keyed into the accounts payable system. The second step to move farther down the path is to automate data entry. We want to get a way of getting those automatically delivered invoices loaded into accounts payable in a seamless way with only a small data entry component to address minor errors in the uploaded data. Step 3 is to automate the exception handling process. And this is something that's typically handled through the implementation of a workflow solution. Many companies stop at that point, at the automating the exception handling process. But really to achieve that perfect straight-through processing, the invoicing nirvana, we want to eliminate the exceptions. And the first step in that is to conduct a root cause analysis of the exceptions. What I'm talking about here is trying to find the real reason an exception occurred. Many companies look at what the exception is, like the price on the invoice exceeds the purchase order, or the goods, the quantity on the invoice exceeds the goods that have been received, etc. But what they don't do is take a step further and really determine whether the supplier is making the error or someone inside the company is making the error. I would encourage anyone going down this path to perform an in-depth analysis of the exceptions that they're experiencing. Once that analysis is complete, then they can move on to step 5, which is preventing the errors at the source. Sometimes that means imposing stricter rules on which invoices will be accepted and communicating those requirements to the suppliers so that they invoice properly. Sometimes it means educating internal users and imposing standards on internal users to improve the quality of their inputs into the process. So the quality of the purchase orders and the quality of the receiving activity involved. And lastly, sometimes this means that you should change the way your system approves invoices, maybe by adjusting tolerances. To provide some more specific details, we've put together a list of 10 cultural and process changes that can have a significant input to achieving straight-through processing. The first is measure it. As we said before, only 43% of companies are measuring their exceptions. And most companies measure how many invoices are in a held status or can't be processed as of a given date, but they don't really track the metric over time. How many exceptions occurred in a given month or a given year? And we all know the maxim: if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So step 1 is measure it. 2, conduct the root cause analysis, which I described a moment ago. 3, hold business people accountable. So what this really means is hold your internal users in procurement and in finance accountable for the exceptions that they've caused. And sometimes this can be difficult to do, but in many cases the right answer is simply just to publish the metric. Publish by business division or by department how many invoices related to that given department or business unit resulted in exceptions. This can create some internal competition to reduce the number of exceptions. Change behavior in purchasing. What we're talking about here is primarily training. We need to train our purchasing personnel that when they make mistakes on their purchase orders, there are downstream effects in accounts payable that result in waste, and they need to be thinking about ways to prevent that waste as they do their jobs. Develop supplier scorecards. This has been very effective in many companies where they produce supplier scorecards that help suppliers know what they're doing to increase the cost of doing business with a supplier. And so if you publish to a supplier the number of invoices that they've sent that were exceeded the purchase order price or quantity, or that generated other exceptions, then they can improve their behavior. Next, consider imposing stricter invoice requirements. The most obvious of these is you can begin telling your suppliers you will not accept an invoice unless it contains a valid purchase order number. That's the one we see used most commonly. In cases where non-PO invoices are important to leave in place, then you can impose a rule like there must be a valid contact name or email address provided on the invoice. Next, consider adjusting your tolerance levels in your system. If you examine the number of exceptions that are happening related to exceptions very close to the tolerance levels in your system, you may find it's going to save a lot of time and expense without introducing much risk if you move your tolerance slightly. Next, delay reporting of good receipt exceptions, particularly in automated invoicing environments where, for example, when you have e-invoicing in place, it's very common for the invoice to arrive before the shipment arrives. So we've seen many companies process the invoices when they arrive, but if there's a goods receipt exception, they'll delay reporting of that exception to the receiving staff for some period of time in order to allow enough time for the shipment to be to make it to the company and to be entered into the system. Blanket order and service orders. We've seen some companies implement what we're calling here tacit approval thresholds. So invoices for blanket orders and service orders must be approved, but if the invoice is below a certain dollar threshold, instead of requiring a true interaction with the person responsible for the purchase order, Accounts Payable sends a message to the person who is responsible and says, we're going to pay this invoice on its due date unless you tell us otherwise. Any invoice that's above the threshold, the invoice would be put on hold until the end user contacts AP and tells them that the service has been provided or the good has been delivered. And then lastly, implement P2P automation solutions. The technology today, like OB10 and other e-invoicing solutions, can move some of the validations around your invoices earlier in the process so that a supplier gets real-time feedback about the exception and has an opportunity to correct the invoice before they send it through to you. Then there's automation of entry into your system that comes through systems like OB10s. Workflow solutions help automate the exception handling. Through these technologies and other reporting capabilities, you can really achieve greater straight-through processing. Now, we haven't been able to go into a lot of depth around each of these items, so we've put together an ebook called Rooting Out Invoice Exceptions, The Path to Straight-Through Processing. And this ebook will be provided to everyone on this call for free, and some more details around that will be coming to you soon. In conclusion, just summarizing what we've said, the invoice exceptions are inflicting a high and hidden costs on companies. They're driving operational costs, disrupting supply chain, and hurting business relationships. We want to redefine the standard to straight-through processing. A lot of technology can be implemented to help AP control the inputs and to achieve straight-through processing by improving the inputs into their process. And lastly, there are a lot of cultural and process changes that you can implement to complete this package and achieve straight-through processing. Again, this is a snapshot of the ebook, which we'll be sharing with everyone on the call.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Danny. A very informative and useful webinar for everybody. There has been a couple of questions in for you, and perhaps the first one, to some extent, you've just covered. But someone is asking that, or saying that, in an attempt to increase their PO compliance figures, they've used a lot of blanket orders since that suits their diverse business needs. And they're saying that this is now having an adverse effect on their exceptions. Is that, they're asking, is this a common occurrence, and how would you overcome this?
Blanket orders present an interesting challenge because since the order is covering a large number of deliveries over a large period of time, it's easy for the invoices to come in for a while and everything to be fine, but then 9 months down the road you find an invoice that has exceeded the purchase order, goods receipts, total goods receipts for the year, and it becomes a struggle to go back and discover which of the invoices along the way caused the problem. What I see most commonly done by companies who have blanket orders and want to address this challenge is they implement a process where every invoice that comes in must have a bill of lading number on it that can help the accounts payable team tie the invoice to the shipment and to the specific goods receipt that's associated with it. That way they're able to stay on top of any invoicing exceptions that happen along the way. The second piece of it is what I mentioned earlier. They may delay the reporting of the invoice exception if the associated goods receipt hasn't been entered yet. And the way they would normally do that is, or the way I've seen it done, is they delay the reporting of the invoice exception for a week or 1 week before the invoice is due, whichever comes sooner. So by doing that, you're giving yourself time to process the goods receipt, but you're also making sure that the exception is handled before the invoice is late.
Okay. And another question for you, Danny. Someone's asking how OB10 handles the smaller suppliers that perhaps lack technology or the ability to accept e-invoicing.
Sure. So the smaller suppliers are accommodated in a few ways. We try to make it as simple as possible for the supplier by offering options that are most palatable to them. We let them choose. So we can accept any structured file that's coming out of their billing system and we go to the effort to build a custom map for the individual supplier if they prefer to send us a structured data file. The other alternative is we allow suppliers to go to our website and create the invoice online. And there are 3 very simple ways to create the invoice online. If they're a purchase order recipient, then they can just go right online, pull up the purchase order, click a button to convert that purchase order into an invoice, make any minor changes they want to make, and then submit the invoice. So in that case, you really can drive out exceptions by using the PO as a template for the invoice, and our suppliers find that as a very convenient option. The second option is they can create an invoice for from a template. So this is particularly useful for non-PO invoices. The supplier can build an invoice one time. Let's say they have a monthly billing to their customer. They can build the invoice one time and then every month just come in and create a new invoice directly from that template. Just change the date. If they need to modify the amount, they can. If they don't have to submit the invoice from template. And then the third option is they can just go in and create an invoice from scratch using our user-friendly invoice template inside the system. We also make it easy for suppliers as well because for suppliers who are doing low volumes, we give them their first 12 transactions for free. So they can get used to the system before ever incurring any expense to use the system.
And then finally, one last question is, what are the biggest or most common obstacles in driving supplier adoption for e-invoicing?
Well, the biggest challenge in driving supplier adoption is really the internal commitment of the company to the program. We find when a senior leader in procurement makes the decision that this is important, the impact of a solution, an automation solution like e-invoicing is the right decision, then if they can go all in with that decision and communicate well within procurement and finance and anyone else involved in the process inside their company that this is the solution, then we find that suppliers accommodate the solution, particularly if they have a solution provider that allows them to use whatever methodology for submitting the invoice that they're comfortable with, whether it's a structured data file or on the web. Just to say again, the biggest obstacle is the commitment of the company to the program.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks, Danny. A fantastic webinar, and as I say, I'm sure we've all got some really good nuggets of information and learned a great deal from that today. So thanks very much. And I know that we've had a few people asking about the slides. So yes, they are available after the presentation. So I'll be emailing those to you. I'll be sending a feedback form for you to fill in just about the webinar today. Always great to get some feedback from you guys. And once we get those back, we'll be sending the webinar slides through to you. And of course, if you have any further questions that occur to you after the webinar, please do send them through to me, and I can be sure to get those answers back to you. So thanks very much for attending, and do keep a lookout for the next APN webinars coming up over the summer. And I do hope that you'll be able to join us again for one, or if not all of them, as they come up in the next few months. So in the meantime, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks once again for attending. Thank you. Goodbye.